What happens when illness, trauma, or grief disrupt the life you thought you had planned? In this episode of the Legacy of Love podcast, I sit down with 𝐃𝐨𝐧'𝐭, a licensed marriage and family therapist with over 13 years of experience supporting individuals and families through some of life's hardest moments. Whether you're caring for an aging parent, navigating medical trauma yourself, or simply trying to support a loved one who's struggling, this conversation is for you. 𝐃𝐨𝐧'𝐭 shares powerful insights on grief, compassion fatigue, and why getting curious before jumping to solutions can change everything. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by caregiving, I know I do quite regularly, or you're unsure how to have a hard conversation with your loved one, this episode will leave you feeling supported and hopefully also empowered to show up a little differently, maybe with a little more grace and understanding. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did. 𝐃𝐨𝐧'𝐭, welcome to the Legacy of Love podcast. I'm so happy you're here with us.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so before we dive into, all my questions and this important conversation, I would love to start off with us getting to hear about why you do this work, what brought you to really focusing your practice around grief and loss, and also this area of medical trauma.
Great question. So, I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, which means I work with individuals, couples, and families. I work with all kinds of clients in that regard. And I was really drawn to the world of medical trauma and grief and loss because of my own life experiences. I dealt with a lot of health issues when I was younger, and I saw that the impacts that had not only on myself, but my family. And I also looked around to other patients around me and noticed, why some people healed more quickly and better and some people didn't. And that always kind of fascinated me. And that intersection of physical health and mental health always fascinated me. And the other piece of that is I'm very passionate about women's rights and gender issues. And medical trauma comes up a lot in relationship to reproductive health, gender affirming care, all of those types of things. So it really encompassed a lot of my passions.
Oh, I love that. I mean, that makes so much sense. I wouldn't say I had medical trauma, but I was a pretty sick kid. I was kind of in and out of the hospital a lot, and I was a chronic ear infection child. But bringing me to like health and wellness, and I mean, that really started my journey young, kind of this like healing path and looking for alternatives. And I think, like you said, this interest in the intersection
Yeah,
between our physical health and our mental health and the mind body spirit connection, right?
absolutely. And what helps people get better and what doesn't. There's so much aside from just the medical condition that leads people to have better outcomes or worse outcomes. And that has always been really fascinating to me.
Oh, likewise, right? And I think so much with our systems, I mean, like most systems, we live in a sea of, I think capitalism and patriarchy.
Yep,
And
100%.
that makes sense. I minored in women's studies, so that thread is also kind of always interested me. I think also as, as a mother, and also I worked as a case manager in the past as well, so
Mhm.
advocating for clients. That's an interesting lens that you bring. I'd be curious, do you want to speak to that at all, of pulling back a few layers of talking about, ways that we can support, whether it's ourselves or our loved ones, with these, I'm thinking the medical system, I don't know if you have any tips in that regard, in that area.
Yeah, I think a good place to start is to realize it's not just about what we call, quote unquote, the identified patient, right? Illness, injury, really affects the whole system. And when I talk about the
Mm,
whole system in this context, really talking about the family system, but it can be everyone associated with that quote unquote identified patient, right? So as a marriage and family therapist, that is our lens, is a very systemic lens. So it lends itself well to this kind of work because we see that no human exists in isolation, right?
yeah.
Especially when you're going through an illness or injury, you know, that affects everybody around you. So starting at that place to acknowledge whether you are the patient or the caregiver or a friend, that it's impacting you too, and accepting that and realizing that can be the starting point to getting the care and assistance that ideally you need, even though we know oftentimes that that can be challenging to access.
Oh, yeah, that's such an important point. I'm glad that you said that. And I also see that in my practice. I support a lot of families and I also specialize in an area called special needs trusts. But a lot of times, I'm working alongside, let's just say, both parents, and then they have an adult child who has a diagnosis, whether that's, a developmental disability, a mental illness, for whatever reason, they're needing to set up this special needs trust. And I think looking through that lens and really acknowledging how that impacts, the entire family system
Right.
is so important. I love that you're doing this work. Do you really focus in supporting individuals, or are you working really more as a family, therapist?
Yeah. Yeah, I do both. Honestly, it really depends on the situation and the case and that's presented to me. So I will have individuals reach out who are dealing with medical trauma, health issues, you know, what have you, and kind of want to work on a one-on-one basis, and that's absolutely great and fine. And then I also do work with families and couples facing similar challenges. So it just depends, but I like to have that choice at times because different interventions will help, you know, people differently. And so I think if people are open to coming as a family or a couple, that can be a really amazing experience and really help the unit both kind of currently and later on, depending on what they're facing down the road.
Are you finding that you're working with people like when they receive like that initial diagnosis, or is it much later when, there's been kind of like a medical trauma, or they've been years in this, maybe the individual or the family system or the couple is really kind of realizing like, oh, we need more support.
Yeah, I find I see both, to be honest with you. I mean, I love when people recognize that they need that support earlier on. But yeah, sometimes it doesn't happen till much later when they realize the true impact of what they've been going through. But I definitely see both.
Yeah, I think that's a lot. Like, it sounds like we support families in similar and different ways, but
Totally.
so much, I think, when I'm supporting families in the planning phase, is reminding them that, especially for like the caregiver, to get that support early on, to not
Yes.
wait until, you're now in in crisis, right? Building that team early on, I really see it just a night and day difference,
Yeah.
and also like building in those practices. And I think it's also when we're supporting our loved ones, especially as they age and decline, and, whether we're getting a diagnosis like cancer or dementia and Alzheimer's, we can really just get so focused on supporting that one person and leave ourselves aside.
Yeah.
So really speaking to kind of that, let's kind of dive in a little bit more to supporting our loved ones
Yeah.
with whether it's, you know, a diagnosis like, cancer, or a diagnosis like dementia. Well, that's going to look very different.
Right.
What are some maybe tools, tips, support that you like to share with caregivers
Yeah.
specifically?
First of all, shout out to all the caregivers out there. You're doing amazing work and you're very valued. And I'm sure you don't hear that enough. One way that we can really support whoever is going through the illness, that individual, is by really empowering them and giving them a voice. A lot of times, as loved ones, we want to fix things for the people that we love, right? Especially when someone is suffering, either physically or emotionally. And the goal isn't always to fix what's going on, but rather I encourage people to reframe the goal of interacting with their loved one as understanding, and then they can move to problem solving, right? Because from what I hear from people dealing with illness and injury is that it can be extremely isolating, right? And people are kind of working above them or around them and aren't interacting with them, right? So really remembering that this is a person, not just a problem, quote unquote, and making sure that you're elevating their voice, both within like the family unit and their social unit, but also with their providers.
Oh, that's so important. That's honestly a lot of the work that I do, and a lot of the education and training needed in order to become a licensed fiduciary, at least in the state of California. It's
Mm-hmm.
exactly what you're speaking to. It's really of supporting and not speaking for, you
Yes.
know, it's really of supporting and advocating for them. And so often, I think when you have kind of the layers of, your family relationship,
Yep. Yep.
you know, I
Absolutely.
think that's one of the benefits of working with a professional is that we can be a little bit more neutral and we don't have that dynamic, but that can also kind of just add an extra layer when it's a lot of times, adult children need to step into
Yes.
the role in caring for their parents as they
Yes.
age and decline. And that really can shake, right, the family system, because
Yep.
now the matriarch and patriarchs are kind of, feeling not seen and losing their kind of place or status in the family.
I think what you're alluding to is so complex and multifaceted in terms of all families have norms, rituals, spoken and unspoken understandings. And what happens when families are facing a really challenging time is a lot of times those are brought to the surface and they're expressed in explicit ways instead of staying implicit. And that can cause some turmoil or misunderstandings. And so understanding what your context is within the family and like understanding people's roles, how traditionally people have communicated, whether that's explicitly or implicitly,
Yes.
really bringing all those things to people's awareness so that they can make informed choices about how they interact with one another instead of kind of just fumbling along and, you know, doing trial and error, trying to figure out what works best.
Wow, that's so true. And I think that's a lot of, what inspired me, or one of the areas that inspired me to start this podcast and really reflect on our legacy. Sure, part of it is we can get our legal documents in place, but it
Yeah.
can be so much more than that, that we can really proactively and begin to tend this garden, whether it's just within ourselves and our family, of having these conversations long before there's a crisis.
Yes.
Because when we're really not having these, challenging conversations or willing to look at our own mortality in life, what I find with people that are really choosing to avoid this area, and it's, like you're saying, it's more of the implicit, right?
Yes.
Rules.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. That when there's a crisis and then families are kind of forced into these conversations that they never discussed before. And that's
Right.
where it can just be, a less ideal path to travel.
Totally. Yeah. It's not as empowering as if you say, okay, I know this is going to be uncomfortable, but I know it's a gift to be able to have this conversation long beforehand because we're choosing to do it on our terms, right? And it also goes against a lot of cultural kind of scripts too, because as a culture, we don't love to talk about death. We don't like to talk about aging or illness or money, right? None of those
Right.
things are encouraged to discuss. So you're not only dealing with the wider society's kind of rules around these conversations, but then also your families and then your own personal, relationship to these topics. So it can be
Yes.
extremely challenging to like break down these different influences.
Well said. And I really couldn't agree more. I've had a few money coaches as guests on the podcast, and, looking at our relationship to money, I think very much is part of the conversation. Also, looking at our relationship with death. And
Yeah,
like you're saying, we're all kind of swimming in the same, I think, ocean where, culturally these are big taboo subjects and we don't talk about and we really shy away from. Do you have any kind of wisdom to share of for people maybe just like in the planning phase, like
mm-hmm.
maybe there hasn't been a medical diagnosis, maybe you have aging parents that might be kind of still avoiding the subject. Do you have any kind of support or wisdom to share of how we can begin to have these conversations in a more proactive way?
Absolutely. So much of what I teach people to do is to communicate effectively. And that, spans generations, it spans gender, it spans everything. I think, again, starting from this place of curiosity rather than coming in with judgment or a specific agenda and having that mindset is so important, especially when you're dealing maybe with parents or people who might have kind of a different worldview than you or different understanding than you, and acknowledging that. So coming in to the conversation with curiosity, being mindful of some of the basics like timing, place, how many people are you going to have with you, right? You don't want to feel like you're ganging up on someone
Right, or ambushed.
or ambushing them, but
Yeah.
and you want a gentle startup, what we call gentle startup, which is you don't just dive in like, hey, so let's talk about when you die, right? Maybe like, maybe you have children and you're saying, I was thinking so much about how much I love my children. And I thought about how lovely our relationship is. And I care so much about you. And because I care so much about you, I want you to go into the future feeling peace about the future. Right. So, like a
Mm.
gentle startup into the conversation, especially when you know it might be a challenging conversation, and having a clear idea that even though this might be really uncomfortable, being very clear of why you're doing this. So, why are you facing some of these uncomfortable emotions? And for most people, it's because they love their family and they truly do want what's best for them. So, those are some kind of basic, like, before you even really start a conversation or just like at the very beginning of the conversation. And like I said before, finding that the goal of the interaction, first and foremost, before problem solving, is understanding where your family member is at, right?
Mm.
Understanding their positions and that there's meaning under every story or stance that your family member has.
Oh, I love that. Right.
Yeah.
Just getting curious, right? The power of that. That really is, I think, a practice
Yeah.
at the end of the day.
We usually all go to problem solving first, and that's
Yes.
not inherently bad, right? We need problem solving. However, can we suspend that for a little bit just so that you can understand the perspective of your family member and kind of honor the meaning behind whatever their stance is or perspective is?
Yes. And again, talking kind of about the sea that we all live in, I mean, I feel like that's a lot connected to like this hyper extreme of capitalism that we're in,
Right.
where it's like, oh, it's really inefficient to talk about feelings. Like
Right.
we
Yeah.
have stuff to do. Like, let's get down to business.
Yes. Yes.
And I think that bringing in that kind of energy can really be so counterproductive because it puts, everyone kind of on the defense
Yeah.
of like, oh, I need to change, and I become like, feeling on the agenda. I've actually,
Yes.
worked with a lot of clients where it's not only me, I'm sitting and working and supporting the whole family, and they'll kind of make jokes about either a sister or the children, kind of they have exactly that, an agenda. So
Right. Yeah. And you can
yeah.
sense that if you're on the other end, right? You
Yes.
can sense
Yeah.
that and it doesn't feel good. And what are you going to do? You're like you said, you're going to get defensive. You're going to clam up and probably disagree with whatever solutions are being brought up just because you want to kind of assert your autonomy and independence.
I love those two tips though, just kind of going in with a gentle start and even, I'm thinking like a somewhat script of knowing like,
Yeah,
oh, if, I want to have this conversation with my loved one, this is maybe a softer opening and
yes,
might, also what I think is not only are you having an important conversation, but it's really an opportunity to be closer to your loved one, right? For
yes,
better
yes.
understanding of getting curious. I'm also curious on your thoughts about this because so often when I start working with clients, they're getting diagnoses like Alzheimer's or dementia. There's an obvious decline or a sudden shift. That's usually when, I become kind of more involved in my client's life. And so often I've seen, with people that haven't gone through this before in the first time, the the family doesn't quite understand these diagnoses and there's not really this like getting better. And I
Right.
think again, so much with our medical system, it's more of the landscape of, oh, we get a treatment and then there's this cure.
Totally. Yeah.
And so as we age and decline, it's really kind of shifting how we're looking at supporting our loved ones. And well, and I guess it's not only when we age. I mean, there probably is also plenty of young people that are getting these diagnoses. And, I'm sure in the work that you deal with of specializing in medical trauma, sometimes it's not a getting better. It's how can we really kind of bring this kind of welcoming that and knowing like, okay, how can we create the most loving, joyful life alongside this? So I don't know if I'm assuming you have more to say on
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
more than I
I
do.
mean, what comes up for me when you say that is really stepping back again and looking at like socially, we don't turn towards discomfort in a really productive way,
Yeah,
right? When we experience discomfort, whether that's internally or externally, we tend to turn away from it, try to get rid of it, ignore it,
problem
and
solved. Look
problem
to fix
solve,
it.
right? And
Yeah.
so, over time, first of all, that can create like generational patterns within families of like how discomfort is dealt with, and that can become like kind of issues in and of itself. But
Right.
again, looking at this wider lens of whether it's chronic illness or degenerative diagnoses, whatever it is, it's a completely different mindset than the trajectory that you alluded to, which is like a diagnosis, treatment plan, and then you get better and you live your life. So, in my opinion, it's really this relationship to discomfort that
Mm,
socially, on a wider level and on kind of the micro level, we need to start to look at and challenge because, I mean, most people listening to this like understand life is hard. There's a lot of
yeah.
really tough stuff in life, and it's not about like escaping that, but it's about facing it. And how do we face that stuff head on with love and compassion and meaning as opposed to trying to run away from it. And that will completely change your experience.
Right, isn't it? Yeah. I mean that's for me where, the last year like my daily meditation practice has become a non-negotiable because
Yeah.
it's just really putting that oxygen on our, for ourselves,
Yes.
especially as we care, for people going through a lot of challenges and we're going to have our own experience, our own emotions around that. What I find is that the more that I, have that practice, the more that I can really cultivate this, rolling out the mat for all the feelings,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Absolutely.
And I think it's so
Yeah.
much of, again, this in the culture in the US where it's like our idea of what happiness is.
Hmm.
And for me, what I've been more after is like, oh, living a life of like alignment and
Yep.
and joy. And but there is this whole rainbow of emotions that come with it, right?
Absolutely. It's about living the depth and breadth of what life has to offer, not limiting your
Yes.
experiences. Because when you try to limit the bad, you're going to limit the good as well. And I
Yes.
want to just say this is by no means discounting the suffering that people experience, the very real day-to-day suffering that people experience. Anyone that knows me, I'm not like this toxic positive, put a smile on your face and everything will be okay. But it's about elevating all experiences and not
Yes.
not leaving anything out and redefining what a valued, meaningful life looks like to you in the context of your current circumstances.
I love that. Uh,
Yeah.
I'm curious. So I'm thinking that I'm probably there'll be other professionals that support people maybe similar to me, not maybe not only private fiduciaries, but
Yeah.
I'm thinking just attorneys, financial advisors, any professional that's really supporting, families and multiple generations. And what I find is, death and dying and loss and grief becomes part of our work of supporting people, especially when we're thinking about legacies
Mhm.
and multiple generations. So, do you have any advice, maybe like things of not to do? Like, this is not helpful, and maybe here's a better way. Like, I don't
Yeah.
know, a big thing for me where I'm like, it's not kind of going in of, oh, how are you? Right?
Yeah.
With
Yeah.
some clients and families where it's like, I know you're going through a tremendous amount of like either loss or crisis, but anyways, I'd be curious on any wisdom you can share with us on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because, in my profession, I take a lot of like social emotional skills for granted. But I'm like, well, doesn't everyone like have this barometer,
Yeah.
And I know that's not
Unfortunately
the
not.
case. I know. I think for especially professionals who are helping families in these types of situations is be aware of your own stuff, you know? Be
Yeah.
aware of what you're bringing into the room on any given day, your own biases, your own maybe blind spots or areas that you might shy away from. Like, are you preventing a specific conversation from being had because of your own discomfort? Talking about shying away from discomfort. So I think that's an important one. And also, don't assume you know what your client is going through, right?
Yeah.
In the therapy world, we talk about not over or under assuming the role that something has in someone's life. So
Mm.
take a chronic illness, for example. You don't want to go in and be like, this is your whole life. There's nothing else about you. And you also don't want to go in and be like, hey, what's up? Like nothing's going on, right? You don't want to over or under value the role that this thing plays in someone's life. So
It's that Goldilocks kind of example,
yeah,
right? Not too hot, not
yeah,
too cold. Yeah.
exactly. So being mindful of that as well, I think can go a really long way in creating that connection that ideally if a client trusts you, you're going to help them a lot more than if they're kind of skeptical or turned off by you.
Right. I mean, that's so much in alignment with, my practice and what brings me to this work. And it's also where my preference is to work with people in the planning phase because we're
Right.
building that relationship long before services are needed. And I really feel that I can do a much better job when I know and we've built that relationship and that trust
Yeah.
over like a lot of times it's the decades,
Yeah, absolutely.
over the
Yeah.
years. What kind of came to mind also is I had a yoga teacher years ago, and she would always say, I really show up to the mat like for my students. Like she acknowledged like her yoga practice. It was so important for her to continue that in order to be able to teach and show up and be present for her students. And so that, anyways, that example came to mind when you were, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
for sharing of just being aware of what we're bringing to the table.
Yeah.
What's our relationship like with, grief and loss and making space for that in our own lives. It's so important.
And like you said, as an ongoing practice, not just like, because that can change over time. if you're doing this for decades, your career for decades, like I'm sure your relationship to money and illness and death are going to change over time.
Yeah, and burnout, right? And
And burnout.
compassion fatigue, like
Yep.
all of these things. I mean, I think that that's actually, regardless of whether or not you're a professional, but also, just, families supporting our loved ones through, life transitions. I mean, can you speak to that of burnout and compassion fatigue? What does that present? And maybe it might also help to, I don't know, to define compassion fatigue for maybe listeners that aren't aware of this.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times it applies to caregivers, but it can also apply to professionals, lay people. And essentially, it's when you have used everything in your tank,
Yeah.
emotionally, mentally, physically, even to support other people without kind of reinvesting and supporting yourself. And it's so easy to talk about this as kind of a hypothetical or kind of in a detached way. But if you have experienced compassion fatigue, it's so much easier said than done to be like, yeah, well, just put your own mask on first. The old adage of like, flying a
Yeah.
plane and the oxygen mask come down. Because the reality, like showing up for other people mentally, emotionally, and physically is taxing. And I think a lot of it does speak to, again, societal views of we don't prioritize or really truly value the role of emotional labor in our society.
Yeah.
And I think that is extremely reflected in the way that we do and don't support caregivers of whatever different kinds. Again, whether that's professional or, caregivers at home, what have you. So again, systemically, I think there needs to be like a reckoning of what our values and priorities are as a society.
Right.
Yeah. You're like,
That
word.
yeah, that hit me. I mean, that's been, I think, so much with, I've been doing this work for a decade, and then it's like I had my daughter in the very end of 2022, and it was like, oh, seeing it, at a different season, but
Hmm.
caregiving for little ones. And
Yep.
yeah, this is a huge piece, that emotional labor, all the stuff that isn't really seen or
Yep.
appreciated, and that does primarily fall on women, not
Yep.
always, but for the most part,
Yep.
and I think also when you're thinking about multiple generations
Yes.
and
Yes.
right.
Well, and women tend to outlive men, right? We know this, that a lot of
Yes.
times they tend to be the caregivers. So, yeah, so I think, again, that's kind of overarching of this conversation of compassion fatigue. And in my experience, so much of what leads to that is isolation, right? Whether
Yeah.
that's we're talking about new parents, we're talking about parents of kids with health conditions, if we're talking about older adults with health conditions, like it really runs the gamut. This isolation piece really, really harms people. So the more we
Mm.
can get people connected with professional support, peer support, is
Yes.
also really helpful in these situations. The better people will be set up to re-enrich themselves as they continue to give to others.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's been so much of, my personal journey, and then also on the other side of seeing
Yeah.
families through, where there's just a night and day difference. And I think really our resilience, it requires connection. It requires being in community, that we're
Yes.
not at this alone. And when we're with our problems, it's just so easy to get, I don't know if it's this like the image that comes to mind is just this head down mentality, and you think you're going to get through this, but when you get these large diagnoses, I mean, this could be, a decade or
Yeah.
longer even.
Yeah.
So it's really of beginning to create that community, that support early on, so that's not requiring this, right? A crisis or you completely empty. You might appreciate this story, but compassion fatigue actually is part of what I saw with my grandparents as they aged.
Mm,
And my grandmother had dementia and ultimately Alzheimer's, and that's what she passed. But my grandfather was her, primary caregiver. They lived out in a rural area, and he was really her, her everything, right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
especially those kind of last 5 years for him. And then my grandmother actually fell and broke her hip, and then that's when she was placed at a skilled nursing facility, in a rehab, and recovered. And then us as a family helped find her assisted living because there just was a significant cognitive decline as well.
Right.
And she wasn't safe at home anymore. And with a month after her being placed, my grandfather passed away.
Oh,
And I really think there was a piece of him knowing like she was taken care of and he was no
yep.
longer needed. And he had such an empty tank. It was like that
Yeah,
compassion fatigue.
yeah.
And once she was kind of set up, there was, and it was a weird kind of series of events where there wasn't like this like serious diagnosis. I mean, his body and all of his organs shut down, and he passed within kind of 5 days of being referred to hospice.
Wow.
And yeah, he died at home. He was surrounded by, his daughter, who's my mom, and me and my sister. And
Mm,
I mean, it really, I think that there were, as a family, we really did come together, and there was a lot of forgiveness and healing in that for
yeah,
us. But I really, reflecting on that, I think that compassion fatigue really was kind of a piece for him where he felt so
yeah,
alone and exhausted and depleted.
yeah. I mean, thank you for sharing that. That's like, I mean, I think it's a fairly common phenomenon, where we hear similar things where once someone has kind of secured something or they know a piece of information that they're able to let go or take time for themselves or what have you, obviously that looks different depending on the situation. But it brings up a good point, I think, which is a lot of times we talk about these things as very cerebral, like the mental
Yeah.
impacts or the emotional impacts. But unfortunately, again, our society like separates those two or and to the physical realm, but all of those things are connected. These things impact your
Yeah.
body. And if you don't get the support you need, your body will start to shut down. Your body will feel it over time, And so even if you want to put yourself last on that list, if you want to be there for your loved ones, it's so important to take care of yourself mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and physically.
I'm curious on your thoughts. What I find is when people get diagnoses, whether it's the individual or the family, a lot of times it's both. It seems like denial is kind of always a part of the process.
Right. Mhm.
Do you think that I mean, it is kind of like part of that process? Is there a way around that? I mean, just a lot of times when I get involved with families, it's like I see where the adult children might not really be understanding that mom and dad aren't getting better, that this is really kind of a different,
Right.
we're entering kind of a different, chapter in life, and really kind of what we were speaking to before, like this is where more
Hmm.
of a palliative care is appropriate, not
Right.
this, curing and fixing and things are going to get better. But I also see with, working alongside my clients where, of really mentally thinking that they can do what they no longer can. And, for me as a professional, I always want to support my clients like autonomy and
Yeah.
freedom and wishes, and do my best to kind of maximize that and not just kind of go and limiting them. But at the same time, I see where there most times is this piece of denial, not really accepting where we're at in the present moment and what the body
Totally.
can do. So I'd be curious on just your insights. Like, is that maybe like just part of like the grief cycle and
Yeah.
stages that it is part of the journey? Or is there something that we can do to maybe have and welcome and bring in more acceptance, and instead of
Right.
just being in this place of denial? Or maybe I'm not thinking of
Yeah.
denial appropriately. So
No, no. I mean, I think definitely like in this work, you notice certain patterns and that's a pattern that really sticks out to you. I think that does come up a lot. It depends on the diagnosis because I also have a lot of people who know something is going on. And once they get a diagnosis, it's like really comforting to have kind of a label to be able to put on it. So I
Yes.
also find that experience as well. But acceptance itself, no matter kind of what situation we're talking about, is a very active process. And I think the way acceptance is understood or misunderstood can be challenging sometimes. So acceptance isn't a one-time thing like, okay, I accept, my parent has Alzheimer's, check. Acceptance is an active daily process of turning
Oh,
towards the present moment and kind of working with what you got essentially. But it's an active process. So with that, I actually, this is kind of a weird comparison, but stay with me.
okay.
So when I worked in community mental health years ago at the beginning of my career, we work with a lot of pretty severely impacted people with chronic long-term mental health diagnoses, such as schizophrenia, delusions, paranoid disorders, that kind of thing. And when you're dealing with people who have those types of challenges, you don't want to go up to them and confront their delusions and stuff head on, right? And that
Yeah.
has helped me understand, like experientially, a lot of ways of challenging people more effectively. You don't want to go to people and challenge them straight to, straight to their face and be like, no, this is happening. This is a reality. That's just not helpful or effective. Really, what you want to do goes back to what we were talking about before. You know, help this person talk about what's going on, help them understand if they don't understand or if they have the capacity to do so, and just like search for understanding rather than telling them what their experience is.
Mm.
Right. And then over time, when they feel seen and heard and trusted, you can gently work a little bit more towards kind of conversations of what is actually happening, right? But that starts with like curiosity about their current experience.
I also had a kind of a background of working with, I mean, most of the time it was mentally ill seniors, but going into
Mm-hmm.
locked psychiatric facilities, working
Yeah.
alongside like people with schizophrenia and delusions. And I hadn't quite made those connections, like you said. So that really helped me. I also feel like my personal work and journey and what brought me to this work, like I've become a much better human because of this.
Yes.
I can be really kind of in my personal relationships, like very direct and to the point. And through like, the years in case management, my fiduciary work, getting more curious, everything you're saying, and not meeting things head on, which kind of
Yes.
is my natural inclination. It does have a ripple effect, not just, again, we don't separate anything,
Right.
right? It's not
Absolutely.
only in
Yeah.
my professional life, it's in all aspects of life that this is really a practice. That I
Mm-hmm.
love that though. Of really, I appreciate that reframe too, that acceptance is a daily practice, really.
Yep.
And
It
most of
is.
us, like you're saying, we think of it as an on and off switch, and it's not.
Yeah. It's not. It's a choice of like, today I'm going to work on facing what today is giving me and how I'm going to choose to engage with what the day is giving me. Of course, some days that's easier than others, right? But it's an intention more so than a one-time thing.
Oh, I love that. Well, Chelsea, this conversation I've taken away so much. So I know that our
Good.
listeners will absolutely love you and your work. We'll absolutely include in the show notes ways that people can get in touch with you. And you were mentioning, so your private practice, you really can only serve in Washington state based on your
Yeah.
license. That's right.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah.
anyone out in Washington, if this interview resonates, which I'm sure it will, and you're looking for support, we'll include all the links to Chelsea. I really appreciate you coming out today. Is there anything that you want to leave listeners with?
I think to just remember that you're not alone and there's a lot of people who are rooting for you and want you to succeed. Take care of yourself. So if you're feeling alone, reach out to somebody, just one person, make that commitment to reach out to at least one person today.
Thank you, Chelsea.
Thank you.